Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. This video is a continuation of the How I Play Mandolin series here on YouTube with the full video available on Patreon. That link will be in the description. This video is going to be about approach notes. So let's get right into the video. To understand approach notes, hopefully you have seen previous videos so you understand some of the terminology I'm going to be talking about. Really, it's pretty simple. Chord tones, color tones, and the four. Now, to really understand approach notes, or to understand them how I understand them, we're going to think about what the connective tissue is between each major scale. Now, modally, you would have to move each chord, and that's a different conversation. We're just going to think about the three chords that are traditionally played together, the 1, 4, and 5. So in the key of G, that would be a G, a C, and a D. So G major, C major, and D major. What are the connective tissue notes that all those scales share, and between them they don't share? Those types of things. How can we use them to kind of lead ourselves into the next chord sometimes? That's going to be what we focus on in this episode. Like I said, some terminology will be from previous episodes, so go check that out. So let's look at a G major scale. Now I'm only going to show you one octave of each scale. And there's a reason for that. As you extend these scales into different octaves or lower into different octaves, the connective tissue or the overlapping of notes tends to become more, right? Or more or different shapes even. Let's think of it that way. So right now, we're just going to take a G major scale from if you're making a chop chord, this G right here. So G, A, B, C, D, E, F, sharp, and G. That's going to be our G major scale. And then our C major scale is going to be pretty much mirrored of that, one string closer to us. Right? C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. If we break both of those scales into the different parts, like we talked about in previous videos, of chord tones and color tones, and the four of each one of those scales, we can see which ones kind of they share and which ones they don't. And when you start to extend these chords again, there are going to be more chances for overlap or more chances for embellishments, because with extended chords, they're typically dominant chords or major chords with a flat seventh, or minor chords with a flat seventh, or whatever. So those combinations become more complex and they give you more options. When we're talking about just basic 3-note chords like we are right now, that's where I want to kind of start our process of understanding these complex ideas, right? So with our G major scale, we have G, A, B, C. Well, right there, obviously a C major is going to have a C, right? It's probably also going to have this D and this E, right? So there's going to be a lot of connective tissue there, right? The share between those, and that's good. But if you watch the last video, we said we want to avoid the 4. Well, that's only if we're, staying in a static chord. Let's say we're playing a song and the idea is to be moving through the key of G and then obviously landing on C. You would use an approach note or approach tones. Those notes or tones or phrases, or however you want to look at it, have the implication that you have a destination. If you're approaching something, you have to be going somewhere, right? You can't be approaching nowhere. You can't just always approach. You have to go somewhere with it. So for example, in a song like 9-Pound Hammer, right? When I'm going to the 4, I'm going to be using some of the tones that are shared between both of those scales. So let's look at what they are right there really quickly. So C, E, C, D, E, F, G. Really, the only difference between a G scale and a C scale right there is going to be that F natural or F sharp. So for G major, it's boom. So they're practically the same, right? So we can use all types of series of notes to go from G to C that are shared, but the shortest distance is going to be to use the third of G, which is this B note, to go there. Now, further along in the episode, we'll talk about some enclosures and things like that, and this comes into account when you go, right? You're using two notes in the shared scale that will allow you to resolve in more of a phrase and more musically rather than just going or, right? So there's the things to think about. But for right now, for the understanding of it, how to voice lead, which is something we talked about in the last video as well, voice leading comes about when you're taking the shortest distance usually. Now you can resolve down and voice lead correctly as well. So there's no like rules to this stuff, you know, obviously you make your own rules. But what you want to think about is what's the shortest distance, right? So if I have the key of G, if I want to get to C, the closest way would be that third, then I'm in the key of C, right? So when I'm in the key of C and I want to go back to G, I just invert that. Right? Just one note down. Those are going to be super easy to understand because these are phrases that you've heard before. They're in probably most styles of music. These super chromatic resolutions, movements, there's not a lot of tension there. Those are going to be natural things that you can start to hear when you start to create your own lines. And if you're just starting to use these arpeggios and stuff, that which I've been kind of pushing here on the channel, where you can kind of see how you can connect the two with that one little note there. And so I think we talked about that a little bit last last episode with the D to G change, where we talked about the F sharp being the third of the D. Right? So the same thing with the D would work, right? Something like that. Especially if you're just starting with arpeggios, what you want to do is find like, where's the closest way for me to get from one chord to the other, and it's going to start like that, and that's going to be an easy way for you to go have a little pickup, go to the right chord, and be able to move through chord changes in somewhat of a musical way. Now, as you can tell, I'm not playing them exactly. I'm not playing them in that fashion either. So try to make sure you're practicing this musically. That's what we want to think about. Awesome. Last time we also talked about there being a G in the key of C. Now, that might be more of a return situation. So I think I practiced an arpeggio like this. Or we talked about inversions, right? Well, you can think of it like this, where we use the third to get into C and the fifth to get out of C. See, it's a much more subtle that way, where the movement, because I was, you know, you really didn't even notice me go back to the root there. those are going to be things that make it much more natural when you voice lead. And so really starting to think about that from the arpeggios perspective, and then you can even extend it out to the full scale. And we're going to look at something right here with a D scale. So let's map out a D scale really quickly. Well, there's one clear note that's not in the G scale. The C sharp, right? But if I'm in the key of G, if I'm going from 4 to 5, that's a cool sound. That's outside, right? So there are going to be certain tones that you notice that, okay, they don't share necessarily these notes. Another example of that would be a B flat in a C. So if you make a C7, these are where extensions come in. Things like that start to tie in, right? So really mapping out all of these scales that you're trying to use are going to be the first thing that you should do. And I suggest doing 1 octave at a time, right? When you do 1 octave at a time, you kind of create a pattern or a shape. And then that shape gets just moved when you go to A and B. Or you'll see where shapes that you're using for, I don't know, maybe like an E, they can be moved down. Down to a B. So really start to understand, okay, this is my shape, this is my home base. Now what can I do with home base? I can easily come right back to it. Now, that D note is shared between a G scale and a D, right? So again, I went in with the F sharp and out with the 5. And I actually use the F sharp there. Actually, so I'm actually going back through still with the F sharp with the flat 7. Flat 7 from a G's perspective, 3rd from a D's perspective. Now, as you start to look for different types of phrasing, what you'll start to see is that a lot of this linear phrasing doesn't really work because it's not really music. So what we want to start thinking about is how to practice things in a musical way. I've shown on the channel before where we alternate arpeggios. Those are things that are more musical, more musically phrased than necessarily just practicing stuff like that. So for an enclosure, we want to think about it like this. We want to think about the scale note before and the approach note directly behind. So for the arpeggio of G, the enclosure would look something like A, F sharp, G. Then for the 3rd of G, which is B, it would be a scale note, which is a C, because a C is the 4th. Right? It's in the scale of G. That would be the scale note, then an approach note. Right? And then the same thing with D. So that was well, what's something that really cool that happens with is you get that C sharp note again. You'll find that these outside notes kind of work very well when you're transitioning, either resolving or going to another home base for a second. So yeah, that's going to be enclosures. Awesome. Those are going to be ways that you can expand upon your understanding of just this arpeggio, right? And you can really use these techniques in any key. Because this is more of a closed position thing, right? No open strings. So that means it will work here. Once you start to see where these patterns start to exist in this shape, you can move them wherever you need to across the fretboard. And I think that's something that becomes really, really helpful when you play bluegrass, because you may be playing in B or B flat or A. Doesn't matter. Right? And a lot of that bluegrass sound is just around arpeggios. So looking for your arpeggio base of the chord changes is going to be a really easy way to get you off the ground playing lead. Once you find those arpeggios, you need to find the connective tissue, which would be the voice leading. But you can use things like devices like enclosures to help you make a more musical voice leading. So this is where the Patreon episode is going to pick up. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing to the Patreon. So let's look at enclosures a little bit farther. So with bluegrass music,